sponsors, our platinum sponsor, which is Better Impact, for their ongoing support. They are a great partner for Live, and we really appreciate them. We do have the hybrid conference coming up with them, which is in October. So October 28th or 29th, depending on your location. The registration is currently open for host sites. So if you have not hosted this before, we make it as easy as possible to bring a group of people together, have a conversation about what's going on in volunteer engagement, and an opportunity to hear from professionals. So highly recommend checking this out. The registration for individuals will be coming up in August. There's also the National Summit. So the first Alive National Summit, which is a national conference on volunteer engagement. It will be happening next year in Sacramento. We're getting ready to release the request for speaker proposals. And so keep your eyes out for that. We are very excited to host this. So more information to come as soon as possible. We are at Alive celebrating our Sweet 16, and we want you to treat yourself. So we're going to drop a link into the chat box with our store. We have a brand new Alive store, and you can go there. You can save 15% today with the discount code that I'm going to pop in there. So treat yourself, support Alive, and then come back and join us in July, where we're going to talk about a person and situation approach to skills-based volunteering. So lots of great things on the horizon. And that is where I'm going to turn it over to our presenter today. And so we are so excited to have Adrienne joining us today to talk about these best buys and how to do them. All right, Adrienne, I'm going to stop share so you can take it over from here.
Thank you so much. And those goodies on the store look really good. I'm excited for that link, Amy. And as we get started, I was wondering, just to make sure everyone could hear me okay, if you can hear me and see my screen, can you give me a thumbs up in the chat or some kind of happy emoji? All right. Thank you. Awesome. Well, I'm glad that you all can hear and see me. And today we're going to be talking about Best Buys, not the store, mastering the art of exit interviews for volunteers. And my name's Adrienne. As was mentioned, I'm based in Baltimore, Maryland. You may have seen the little crab emoji that I put in. And I currently work for a nonprofit called The Phoenix as a program operations manager. And I became a CVA during the spring of 2021. Definitely one of the best decisions I made. And in the chat, I'd love to get to know you all a little bit better. So I'd love to hear your name. We shared location already, maybe your professional role and organization, and what brings you here today. See anything in the chat yet? Give it another minute. All right, we've got people wanting to know exit interview info. Yeah, looking for new tips. Hmm. You want to improve your exit interview survey to get better feedback, to improve your volunteer program, expand knowledge. Well, that is so great. And please keep introducing yourself in the chat, sharing where you're coming from, what you're hoping to learn, your professional roles. And again, I really appreciate you all being here today. And the origins of this presentation, just to give you all some backstory, come from two different places. So I worked with a DEVI, which was the project that investigated, assessed and investigated diversity and equity in volunteer inclusion. It is a multifaceted 3-year investigation that's a collaboration between Arizona State University and Dr. Mark Hager, and then the Council for Certification in Volunteer Administration. During the 3rd year of the project, we had work groups that created toolkits that answered the bigger question, is everyone welcome? And the group that I was in created a toolkit on managing volunteer performance. And you can find this toolkit on Volunteer Matches Learning Center. And more information about a Devi can also be found on the CCVA's website. So within this topic, managing volunteer performance, I got exit interviews and I got really interested in exit interviews. And around the same time that I was winding that up, I called one of my good friends to check in, and she shared with me a little bit about her story leaving a role within an organization, and I'm just going to call her Amber. She was a volunteer for a national organization that ran a helpline, and she assisted on the helpline 2 afternoons a week. She is an amazing person, and they very quickly said, "You're a superstar. Can you become trainer for other volunteers?" So she did, and there were 3 other trainers that trained volunteers alongside her. And there were no strings or sort of timing attached to her role. I think she thinks that they hope she'd stay forever, as we all kind of hope for our superstar volunteers. But after 2 years, she was feeling really burnt out. And she said, I would just love to go back to being a helpline volunteer. She talked to her supervisor and she talked to her fellow trainers. And when she told her fellow trainers this, one of them said, "Yes, I'm actually wanting to leave. Thank you for opening this door." And then the other two said, "We actually would just like to go back to being on the helpline too." And the organization then was kind of shocked and panicked. All their trainers, all their volunteer trainers were leaving them. There was no process for the trainers to pass on their knowledge, to be acknowledged for the 2 years that they had put in. And they felt like the organization was not prepared for them to leave and was, in fact, disappointed in them after they'd given years of their time. So it made for a bad goodbye experience, which inspired me to put this together because the goal is that we, as leaders of volunteers and and people who work with nonprofits and agencies, can use this information so that our volunteers can have goodbyes or really best buys. And so today we'll go over exit interviews 101. What is an exit interview? How do we prepare for an exit interview? Reciprocity and mutual benefit within exit interviews, accessibility considerations, what we should do post interview, and then I'll share my contact information and more resources. So in the chat, I would love a thumbs up if you have ever been given an exit interview as a staff member, a volunteer, or an intern. And if you have not ever been given an exit interview, give a thumbs down. Got a lot of thumbs up, but we do have a thumbs down and okay, a few thumbs downs. Right. So it looks like we're like a little bit mixed in our experience being on the receiving end of an exit interview. And then I'm curious in the chat, another thumbs up if you've ever conducted an exit interview, whether that's for another staff member you've supervised, a volunteer, or an intern. And if you haven't, you can give a thumbs down because you just haven't done it yet. No, surveys instead of interviews. Yeah. I include surveys in this presentation. So they're all kind of under the umbrella of exit interviews. So it looks like we have a lot of experience, which is great doing that. All right. So, at its most basic, an exit interview is a conversation or a survey between a volunteer and a representative of the organization. And that can be a volunteer who is leaving the role that they're in, their specific role, or who is leaving the organization as a whole. I'll be really candid that in a lot of the roles I've been in, we do not give volunteers exit interviews. And we often don't give volunteers goodbyes. So as I've been pushing, right, to do an exit interview or to do more exit interviews and sharing with others about exit interviews, I want to just go over the value proposition so that if you need to get buy-in from volunteers or your board or your supervisor, you'll have that value proposition. The value of the exit interview for volunteers, which is what I'll start with first, is that we acknowledge they're leaving. We have now a way to formally thank them and recognize that they're moving on. We have the opportunity to share the impact of their service on our organization, our clients, and our mission. We also give them the opportunity to be heard. This is a chance for the volunteer to share what they may wish had been different and get those feelings off of their chest. And there otherwise maybe isn't a container or a place for them to share that. They may also want to share something really positive. Someone within the organization has gone above and beyond, and they want that to be noted. Or they want some challenges that they've had to be noted, and they want to tell them specifically to someone within the organization who has some power so that what they're sharing can land in a way that is powerful, that it can help those changes be made. It can pass along those kudos in a way that can potentially reward the person who has been really helpful for them. It's also an opportunity for volunteers to reflect. We know that volunteering can be powerful. It can change perspectives. It can help us grow friendships and networks, and it can ultimately change our lives. So, if we ask guided questions, we can give volunteers the chance to think about what they've accomplished, how they've grown, and then help them frame the experience that they've had for themselves. Value for exit interviews for the organization is huge. We get the chance to receive feedback from people who are leaving their roles or who are leaving the organization. And because they're leaving, they may take a 1,000-foot view versus a volunteer who's taking a survey or having a conversation that's in the midst of a role and is thinking maybe about smaller mechanical things like we're always running out of this supply, right? The person that's leaving is going to have a bit more distant view and may be able to give a different type of feedback that might be broader. Because they're leaving, they may also give more critical feedback than someone currently in the role who maybe feels a little bit awkward about sharing something negative. And they will help us keep institutional knowledge. Volunteers can share with us how they did certain tasks, the type of access or knowledge that they had or that a future volunteer will need. And they can give us information which will help the organization succeed long term. I'm sure one of the things that you've heard about volunteers is, well, we don't like to put a lot of time into training them or resources into training them because they just leave. Well, so do staff members. But if we have a really robust process for getting and keeping that institutional knowledge, it will help to, I think, quell some of that negativity that we sometimes hear about volunteers. We can also offer the volunteer a chance to pivot if a different role is right for them. Sometimes people leave roles due to the time commitment or changes in their abilities, or they're moving, they're retiring. So they'll only be around for 4 or 5 months of the year. They're going to be taking care of a child or grandchild. So they're not available for this role that requires 8 hours a month, but they are available for one that requires 2 hours a month. But it can be appropriate to try to keep them, right? And help them pivot to a role that's going to fit a little bit better, um, if it's possible. And also accurate record keeping. So for those who have taken the CVA exam or who have read the Keith Steele book, you have read that big chapter about the importance of accurate record keeping. And one of my sometimes the least favorite questions I get is, how many volunteers do we have? Because I know that the amount on the roster is different than the amount of people that are active volunteers. So if we have this check out process, we know how many volunteers are currently active. We have a better sense of how many volunteers are active, how many have left. We can even look at why they've left. We can take from this, we can take from this data information that will help us track volunteer retention and figure out maybe why we're not retaining volunteers long term, if that's the goal. Having a process for volunteers who are leaving forces us as organizations and leaders of volunteers to acknowledge that volunteers won't stay forever and come up with that offboarding process so that they do have a goodbye and we can update our records. The same way that we may have processes for staff or clients or donors who, again, we don't expect to stay forever. This is the value of the exit interview for both the organization and the volunteer. And now we'll move on for when to avoid exit interviews because there aren't always appropriate or a good idea for the volunteer or for the organization. If you've asked a volunteer to leave because of conduct issues, an exit interview is not likely to be the best choice for you or for them. If there is a history of abusive behavior towards staff, clients, or other volunteers, you may also want to avoid having that exit interview. And if there are possible legal issues that have arisen which have caused the volunteer to leave the role or you to ask the volunteer to step back from the organization, definitely do not do an exit interview in that case because it can open up a can of worms. So we've just got over when to avoid an exit interview. Although they are great, they're not always appropriate for everyone in every situation. Now we're going to pivot to preparing for the exit interview. I like to be prepared when I go into a conversation that may be a little bit difficult, whether I'm the volunteer or I'm the staff member. And in most cases, doing an exit interview is a good idea. And when we prepare the volunteer, we get the best results. If a volunteer knows what to expect, they know generally the types of questions you're going to ask, they'll have some time to think about the questions that you'll be asking, the topics that you'll be covering, and they'll come in more prepared, likely with better answers. It can also boost their sense of psychological safety if they are prepared in a number of different ways, which can help them share better, more specific feedback. First thing you'll want to share with a volunteer are the specifics of the interview. Are there different types of interviews offered? For some of you, you'll offer volunteers a choice of different types of exit interviews. For others of you, you will not offer them a choice. But they should have a sense of, is it written, verbal, phone, virtual, in person? And where will the interview be held, virtually or in person, or if it's a survey, if it will be emailed? Um, if it is in person, will they be in a private, quiet space in the building, or will they be in the middle of a workstation where people can overhear what they're saying? And it's important for them to, again, have a strong sense of what to expect so that they'll feel safe and comfortable giving the best feedback. Let them know where their answers will be stored, who can see their answers, and in what context. Answers like, will you be taking notes? And if so, why are you taking notes? It's helpful to say to the volunteer if you're writing things down, I know that you're going to have great insights to offer, and I want to make sure that I get them correct. You can also share that if you're going to share their answers with your supervisor or the department supervisor, if they'll share the answers. Knowing that this may limit how much the volunteer shares, but it can also help them feel comfortable sharing more if they know it's a smaller group of people that will see their answers. And you can also share when you would tell other staff or people outside of the organization about the answer. For instance, if there's been a legal violation, if they share child abuse or instances of elder abuse, what context would you share those outside of the organization? For instance, with the police, with CPS. And then you'll want to share with them, where will this be stored? Who will see their answers, and will the answers be aggregated anonymously? When I've run focus groups sharing with volunteers, this is all going to be aggregated anonymously to remove things like gender, age, location. Does help them to share, but sometimes there are volunteers who are doing a role that's a very specific role. And so they know that it may be very hard for their answers to be aggregated, right, in a way that really hides their identity. You'll also want to share the point of the exit interview, because if you're asking them to take the time, potentially come in or pick up the phone or hop on a Zoom with you and getting vulnerable, they want to know why they should do this. So, how will their feedback be used? Are you going to use it to try to make improvements to the volunteer role? And if so, you can add some specifics like you are looking for feedback to improve volunteer training, the overall volunteer experience, help you write a better role description, recruit volunteers differently. It's important to let them know that it's okay if they need to leave or pause the interview or stop and skip a question if they don't feel comfortable answering it. And that may help them prepare if a difficult topic is going to come up, to know that they can say, I don't want to talk about this, but that there's no consequences for that. And we'll talk about now preparing yourself. We've just talked about preparing the volunteer. So ideally, if you're doing this, the exit interview or someone else's, you are trained in active listening and accepting feedback. Be able to ask smart, clarifying questions that show that you are listening. Reflect back what the volunteer has said to you, and overall know how to appear and be engaged in this process. This means that if you're doing an exit interview, you've blocked your calendar off, you're giving the volunteer your full attention, and they can tell by there's your body language or your tone. If it's a verbal interview, they know that you're really there with them and you're paying attention. Also, be able to receive information and feedback that the volunteer is sharing neutrally. It's important not to fight with the volunteer, or they're very likely to close down. Now, if somebody does share there is an instance of child abuse, looking alarmed is standard, and you probably should look alarmed. But if the volunteer, I got feedback once that was like, I don't like the volunteer lounge. Like the couch color is really ugly. That's not a time to fight with the volunteer. That's a time to say, like, okay. And you can, in your head, have whatever response you want. But it's important to appear, again, neutral, generally speaking, when you are receiving that feedback. And you want to create a space, whether it's a virtual space, in person, that is calm and distraction free. So model turning off your phone, ask the volunteer to turn off their phone or their watch if it's possible, and make sure that the environment is quiet, calm, and focused. And some people may respond differently if there's tons and tons of clutter or there's lots going on physically in a space. And so having that calm space can be really helpful. So we've just talked about preparing yourself for the exit interview and preparing volunteers. Now we're going to move on to reciprocity and reflection. It's really important that volunteers feel that they're getting something out of both volunteering and the exit interview specifically. It should benefit both parties. And we've discussed how it can benefit both parties, but I'm going to dig into it a little bit deeper. So it's helpful for you at the beginning of the interview to review what they may have learned, Ask about personal growth, professional growth, and other accomplishments. You can share things from your perspective and ask them questions about their skill growth. You can also ask them questions that will help them consider how they frame their experience, particularly if they volunteered so that they grow professionally. And helping the volunteer, of course, um, pivot to a new role or take some next steps can be really helpful. If someone has come to your organization short term to volunteer, then they'll be returning to or moving to another place, offering to write them a letter of recommendation, whether it's to a professional organization or another nonprofit, letting them know um, letting the other organization know their skills, their talents, what they were like as a volunteer can be helpful for that person in using their skills that they've gained with you and transferring them to their next steps. And so we'll talk now about different types of exit interviews, times to use them and times not to use them. So first type that we'll be going over is the anonymous written survey available online. So, this is great to use when volunteers may want to provide feedback that's a little bit more critical or negative. If you want to receive candid feedback, if you believe a volunteer may fear retaliation, professional consequences, or burned bridges, if their identity is revealed and they share that candid feedback, then that anonymous written survey is the way to go. And if you want to be able to share their feedback widely within the organization, that anonymous written survey may also be the way to go. And don't use um, the anonymous written survey if you have volunteers that have said they don't want to remain anonymous, if they've indicated that their communication preference is verbal, if someone says, I want to know what happens to my feedback, I want that follow up, the anonymous written survey will not make that possible. Some volunteers have said they find filling out surveys cold and impersonal. So, if you want that personal, warm touch, if you believe it's going to be important to see tone or nuance in the interview, that can be very hard with written anonymous surveys. If you need to follow up with clarifying questions, um, and if you want to share follow-up information with the volunteer, like, because of your service trying out this new role, we're now going to be introducing it at all of our campuses, and we're really appreciative that that you were the first person to take this step. We learned so much with you, and we want you to know what we're going to do with this role. That you could not do with the anonymous written survey. If you want to be sure to thank the volunteer or help them pivot to their next steps, the anonymous written survey is not the way to go. So that was the anonymous written survey. And then we have the identifiable written survey that's virtual or in person. And this can be really good for episodic volunteers or volunteers doing short term projects. The volunteer has indicated that they prefer written communication. This is a great tool. If you have volunteers that have indicated that travel, transportation, or technology may be barriers for them, this can be a great way to go. And when I say technology, I mean if they may not be able to use Zoom or Teams if for connectivity reasons, or they don't have a device that will do that. Also, if your organization wants to ask some clarifying or follow up questions, this type of exit survey might be really good for volunteers. It's not the best if you have volunteers that have expressed fear of repercussions about giving critical feedback. Don't use it if you need candid feedback because it is not anonymous. And if nuance and tone are important, this is not the best type of survey to use. So again, this is the written, identifiable surveys that are virtual or in person. And then we've got our one-on-one surveys that are virtual or over the phone. And these are great for volunteers who have indicated they'd like a more personal exit interview, and particularly for people who have been with you long term. This is great for someone who prefers verbal communication or whose exit interview you think will bring up follow up questions or clarification. Use this type of interview if tone and nuance are important, and especially if volunteers have tried out new projects or experiments with you. If you believe that an upsetting topic may arise, you may want to use this type of interview so that you can really reassure the volunteer it's okay to stop and skip questions. And if you want to have that conversation with the volunteer about pivoting to a new role or offering next steps, then this can be a great way to go. But it's not suited for every type of situation, including if the volunteer has expressed fear of repercussions if they give critical or negative feedback. It's not necessarily great if you want candid feedback. And if a volunteer has indicated that travel, transportation, or technology may be a barrier, it may not be great for some of those. So if they have said, for instance, they have poor internet connectivity or they don't have cell phone service, it may be a challenge for them to call or Zoom or Teams in. And then we have our one on one in person. So this type is great for anyone that has a long term relationship with the organization who wants that verbal, particularly in person communication over written communication. If a volunteer doesn't have access to stable Wi Fi or phone, this can be really helpful if they have tried out those new projects or experiments. It's also possible when you use this in person to really see body language so that you can get communication and feedback that may be more nuanced or have a stronger sense of when to follow up on something. And again, if you believe an upsetting topic may arise, you can reassure the volunteer verbally with your tone and with your body language that it's okay to stop or move on from a particular question. And it may not be great if a volunteer has travel, transportation, or technology holding them back. If they are emotionally or physically volatile, I would definitely not recommend the in person one on one. And this, unfortunately, can be the least likely type of interview to elicit thorough and critical feedback about the organization, its employees, or its culture. Because I don't know about you, I feel comfortable writing criticism, very comfortable writing it written. I feel slightly less comfortable on the phone and much less comfortable in person sharing that type of critical feedback. Um, and definitely don't use this type of exit interview if you don't have a quiet, accessible space that is free of distractions. So we've just gone over the different types of exit interviews, when it's maybe best or worst to use this type of interview. And as I think we've mentioned before, you all will get a copy of the slides. So if you want to go over any of these ideas afterwards or with a supervisor or coworker, you can go through all of these and decide what may work best in different contexts for your organization. So I do want to pivot and talk about accessibility considerations. And the first thing that I want to consider and talk about is language. If you haven't heard of plain language style, I strongly urge you to Google plain language style. This is it's kind of what it sounds like. It's written word and spoken word that is simple, and it makes it using plainer, simpler language is more accessible for for different types of volunteers. For those who may be learning English, for those who may have different learning abilities, for people who may get distracted or off course with really long questions. So asking shorter, simpler questions is really helpful in creating an accessible exit interview. And sometimes I've seen questions that are, it's not really a question, it's three or four questions mixed together. So, like, did you do X? And if so, question, question. And if not, blah, blah, blah. can be really hard to follow that and to put that all in a paragraph, whether you're writing it down or verbally. And so if you do have a question and then if yes, follow up, if no, other follow up, ask those questions separately so that it's easier for your volunteers to stay focused and on track and understand what question you're asking and then give you the answer that you're looking for. And if you have a volunteer that doesn't speak English, you will want to put them with someone who does speak their language so that they can have an exit interview. I know I've seen like people, communicating by just speaking louder, and we all know that doesn't help you understand English any better if you don't already. So putting them with someone who can speak to them, but in their language is important if you want to get good information from that exit interview and have the exit interview be accessible for the volunteer. Now, in terms of location, when you're considering what type of interview to offer, make sure that you have especially the one on one exit interview, make sure that you have a private, quiet space, ideally that is ADA accessible without distractions. I'll also add this time of year for those of us in the northern hemisphere, it is really, really hot. So if an interview is going to be outside, because sometimes we don't have indoor spaces, um, make sure to tell the volunteer this or offer possible alternatives because going outside in 100-degree heat would is definitely not accessible for many people. And in terms of the format, again, keep questions shorter, easier to understand, written in if you're they're written questions, minimum of size 12 font. The most accessible fonts are Tahoma, Calibri, Helvetica, Arial, Verdana, and Times New Roman. The slab serif fonts are also considered more accessible. And ensure the background color and the text that have a ratio of 4 to 5 to 1. It is difficult for many people to read text with a black or dark background, or where the contrast is low for the text to the font. So, especially if you have a question versus like the title of the survey, a white or light background is preferable and will be easier for many people to read. And last but not least, have someone outside of your organization, whether it's your mom or dad, your best friend, your partner, go through the exit interview before you deploy it to make sure it's understandable and easy to use. And then post exit interview, you potentially gotten a lot of information and sometimes it is surprising. So definitely thank the volunteer and invite them to follow up if anything comes up. Express that gratitude to them for taking the time to come in and share with you. Take some time for yourself to process the information that's shared, to write notes about what was shared for yourself or action steps that you're going to take. Ideally, don't rush right into the next task. Sometimes exit interviews are very simple. Sometimes they're heavy. Sometimes you don't know which it's going to be. And so blocking off some time for yourself to process is really, really key. In terms of confidentiality, ensure that the feedback you received is kept confidential and isn't accessible to others. So, if you have a written interview, it's not right on the desk where anyone can see it, it's locked up. If it is in a file in your computer, you can add a password to it or put it in a locked file so that everyone in the organization can't access it. I know, like for me in a past organization, I looked up a certain word on our shared drive, and I found someone's mid-year review. I was not supposed to find it, and so it's easy to think, well, nobody will find this in this folder. But sometimes when you do a search, it brings up unexpected things. So password protect it if possible and then follow up on any questions with the volunteer that you need to later, any sort of clarification or any sort of action steps that you've taken. And the action step could be, now that you've helped us with experimenting with this role for 6 months, we're going to be offering it on all of our campuses. We really appreciate it. It can be a very simple thank you or a very simple follow up. So that is it for the presentation. I'd love for you all to stay in touch. I have my LinkedIn here. As I mentioned, I'm based in Baltimore and my email address. And before we go to questions, I did want to share some different resources. The first is from the amazing Susan Sano. She has a whole presentation that she gives about reflection. Susan is a CVA who works at Volunteer Fairfax. And if you haven't heard of Volunteer Fairfax and their webinars, they're fabulous. So check out their website, their learning opportunities. Her reflection presentation is one that you can sign up for online. I think it happens like once a quarter. In the Engage journal, there is, I think that's the most recent issue, there's an article called Ethical Considerations When It's Time to Say Goodbye. Strongly recommend reading that article. Very, very informative. I used an exit interview article by Martha Fraze Blunt, as well as a questionnaire from Western Connecticut State University that I'm happy to share with anyone if you email me. And in terms of how to set up a virtual space, I use the book From Physical Place to Virtual Space. So I will stop sharing my screen and give us some time for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing so many great tidbits that we've gained. I know that folks are probably going to pop some questions in for our Q&A now. So if you have questions, please feel free to pop them in there, and we will get started going through those. All right. Are these easier if you've already developed a relationship with the volunteers? Is the question that's come in. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Uh, Sorry. It is easier if you have already developed a relationship with the volunteers. I think it can go both ways because sometimes volunteers don't want to disappoint you or say something negative. But other times, if they are overseen in a different department and you've maybe trained them or been part of their orientation, because you may be more neutral, they might be more comfortable talking to you. So both, both is the answer. And I have certainly done exit interviews with volunteers who I don't oversee, and it can be really helpful because I'm a neutral person. They, especially if there's been like a little bit of fallout with a staff member or another volunteer, I'm often seen as more neutral, and they can share with me kind of unencumbered, or be a little bit less defensive. Um, and then, would you say it's better for questions to be more generic or vague or specific? Um, that's a really good question, Chelsea. And again, I think it depends on the context. If you have one-time event festival volunteers, you may want to have really specific questions about the event. If you have a long-term volunteer, it can be helpful for them to be more vague or generic because it's over a long period of time. And I think in general, like when I looked at different exit interviews that I liked, I saw that there was a mix of generic questions and then specific questions. Mia asked, do you do exit interviews with one-time volunteers? So the organization I work for now doesn't have one-time volunteers, but when I have worked with organizations that have had one-time volunteers, we did surveys. We didn't do sit down. Sometimes I would do sit down or phone calls with the group leader. So if we had like a corporate group come in afterwards, we'd do an exit interview and talk about next steps if they wanted to come back or any sort of follow-up. But it generally it may, unless there's something really specific you're trying to get at, or you're trying a new thing with one-time volunteers, or you're pulling out a handful, it may not be worth your time to do an exit interview, a sit down verbal exit interview with one-time volunteers. That may be the best time to use that survey. And then Rebecca said, can you name some examples of changes made from exit interviews? How would you recommend structuring a volunteer's feedback to get staff buy-in? So some examples of changes from exit interviews. So I can think of one that, yeah, we used to do this huge event, and we would let any volunteer, one-time volunteer, sign up for any slot. And when we looked at surveys and we did some one-on-ones with like some follow-ups with people who gave negative feedback, we discovered that letting every volunteer, regardless of their relationship with us or their familiarity with us, do certain shifts was not a best practice for us. So we decided that if you were coming in and you didn't know us, you didn't know our campus, it really didn't make sense for you to show up at 5 a.m. to do a shift. That was really for our more experienced people who knew us, who knew our campus, who were comfortable with us, and who had really great camaraderie. But that for the newer people, it was better to have them at a more established shift where they could come in and they weren't doing setup, in part because they just always didn't have a sense of how things should look. Um, and then, how would you recommend structuring a volunteer's feedback to get staff buy in? Um, that's also a great question. When we've had sometimes difficult feedback, like this staff member does not respond to emails or phone calls or texts. I've done things like gone to their supervisor, because that did seem pretty serious. That felt very serious. And then sometimes it was, if it was more general and a little less personal, I would do a feedback sandwich. So what volunteers liked, what they gained, and then the feedback, like during training, we didn't hit on these sort of critical elements, or our volunteer role description says you need to be able to lift 10 pounds. But our volunteers said that really they needed to be able to lift 25 pounds in a lot of instances. And this can be a safety challenge. If they can't, it can also make them feel really bad if because they feel like they can't do this role. Let's incorporate this and change this in the role description or the training. And then I would follow up with like, and they said you were the best trainer they ever had. They really enjoyed this about your training. So that was generally how I would structure it when it was not about the person's performance, but it was about the volunteer experience. And so Stephen asked, would it be recommended that we send an electronic survey link first and then have an option at the end for them to tell us if they want to schedule with a staff member, or be okay with someone contacting them? So yes, that's what we did recently, exit interviews for some of our like really high level volunteers. And so the first question was like name, and then it was, do you want to do the electronic survey, or do you want to have a one-on-one conversation with a staff member? And they could select it, and then some would select phone call, and then some would select Zoom. But we also again had the option that they could do a the electronic exit interview. And because it was such a small program and it was run in a few different locations, we didn't give them the option to be anonymous. But if we had, I would have said on the electronic one, like, do you want us to follow up with you? If so, please provide your name.
Awesome. We have one more in the Q&A. It's from Colin, and it says, it sounds like it's okay to have multiple versions. I came into this thinking I needed one standard exit interview, but having a variety better suits mine and my volunteer needs. How would you recommend advocating for this when leadership often pushes for a single consistent option?
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would ask them, I would, sometimes it's helpful to compare to what we do for employees, and sometimes it's not helpful. So I would probably take the tack that if we have our, if we have our executive director and someone who is in a frontline role, we're not probably going to give them the same exit interview because they've had very different experiences. The same way that a volunteer that came for one day is going to give us totally different feedback than, I mean, sometimes they're sometimes they're with us for 20 years. And so those volunteers are going to give us very different feedback. Also, what is the goal of the exit interview? If the goal of the exit interview for the short term experimental role is to find out if we should continue, it doesn't make sense for us to ask that person the same questions as the person that's doing a long term role that we definitely know we're going to keep. And if you run big events that are, um, like you have an exit survey for that type of event, then it makes sense. You're trying to get feedback about that event too and figure out how to make the volunteer experience different. And sometimes those events look completely different from what volunteering at your organization looks like the rest of the year. And so, again, doesn't make sense to ask the same questions. You can keep exit interviews fairly simple for all of these different types of volunteers, but they're doing very different roles, having very different experiences. So if you go back to the why, if you ask everyone the same questions, it's not going to be helpful for you in getting the information that you need.
I love that. That was a great, um, very helpful to have that and share that back with leadership. So thank you so much. That is all the questions that I see that have been dropped in. I'm going to go back and I'm going to share my screen because we are um, so thankful that you all are here, and we love to get feedback as well, which seems very timely that we have this slide next. So if you want to go in and give us some feedback on the session, we'd love to hear from you about what you would like to see in the future as well. We've always found these to be really engaging, and we are scheduling through the end of the year. So we are excited to get these on our calendars. We're so thankful that you took this time to invest in your professional development and for coming. Adrienne, this was a wonderful conversation. We had some really, really great questions. So we are so thankful for your time as well. Please keep in touch with us, volunteeralive.org. We have our LinkedIn and Facebook and social media accounts as well. You can reach us at programs at Volunteer Alive. And if you are not a member yet, we highly recommend becoming a member. We have Alive Academies, we have communities of practice, mentor opportunities, all kinds of training and development specifically for folks who are engaging volunteers, as well as an amazing network like this that you get to learn from each other. So highly recommend checking out the different options for membership, including our Pay What You Can, because we know not everybody has budgets for their volunteer engagement programs, and it can be a bit cost prohibitive at times for some training, but we have a Pay What You Can here at Alive, so we would love to support you on this journey. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and have a great day.
Can I share a super quick anecdote?
Yeah, fun.
I recently got to spend some face time with my coworkers, and I normally work remote, and I overheard one of them telling another one about Alive. He was like, "It's like such a great resource. I have no idea where I found it." And I was like, "You found it from me." But
So
it was so cool to hear other people validate how amazing Alive is and tons of different roles that they do.
absolutely. I'm on the board because when I got thrown into this role 19 years ago, I said, okay, cool. I don't know how to manage volunteers. And so this was the source that I went to learn. And so such a great network. Cannot say enough about our Alive membership. So Alive is our tribe. Yes, Carol, I love that.
That's the
Colin, it's been a
next
lifeline.
that's the next shirt. Alive is our tribe.
Right? That's our next shirt. It's lovely. Yes, it truly is such a blessing. So, again, if you have not joined us as a membership, we really encourage you to do so. So many great things coming up. Thank you all for being here. We hope to see you in July.